The night of September 12, 1968, was so dark that even the stars seemed afraid to show themselves above Con Thien. Monsoon rain fell in sheets, turning the red clay into a sucking mire that swallowed boots and bodies with equal indifference. Inside the battered perimeter of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, fewer than 200 men remained alive, and most of them were wounded. For 48 straight hours, North Vietnamese regiments had been probing, rushing, retreating, and rushing again, each assault preceded by a storm of mortars and 130mm shells that walked the wire like the footsteps of an invisible giant. The sky above them belonged to the enemy. Every time an American jet tried to roll in, streaks of orange fire rose to meet it. Phantoms and skyhawks blossomed into brief, terrible flowers and fell burning into the jungle. Helicopters never even made it close. The lucky ones turned back trailing smoke. The unlucky ones simply vanished. In a water-filled crater near the command bunker, First Lieutenant Daniel Riley pressed a blood-crusted radio handset to his ear and screamed into it one more time. "Any station on this net, this is Lima 6 Actual. We are being overrun. Repeat, we are being overrun. If anyone can hear me, for the love of God, send us something." The only answer was the hiss of static and the wet slap of rain on his helmet. Somewhere behind him, a Marine sobbed uncontrollably between bursts of fire. Riley closed his eyes and waited for the final human wave that would finish them. 3,000 miles away, in a fluorescent-lit basement room deep inside the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stood alone beneath the cold glare of a single map light. The walls around him were covered with aerial photographs, twisted wreckage of F-4s, shredded rotor blades, and red arrows showing NVA divisions pouring south across the DMZ faster than anyone had believed possible. McNamara's famous slicked-back hair was disheveled, his tie hung loose, and his eyes were red from 3 sleepless nights. On the steel table in front of him lay a thin manila folder marked Eyes Only, Operation Big J. He opened it slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the pages inside might burn his fingers. The top sheet was a single photograph, the unmistakable silhouette of a battleship, 4 raked funnels, 3 massive triple turrets, a bow like a cliff. Beneath the photograph, typed in capital letters, were the words USS New Jersey, BB-62. Current status, mothballed, Bremerton, WWII. Reactivation time, 6 to 8 months. McNamara stared at the picture for a long time. He had spent the last 7 years convincing the world that wars would now be won by systems analysis, by computers, by air-delivered smart bombs and missile-carrying destroyers. Battleships were museum pieces, relics of a barbaric past. He had said so himself, publicly, repeatedly, and with absolute certainty. Yet here he was, at 3 o'clock in the morning, tracing the outline of 9 16-inch guns with a trembling finger and whispering the sentence no one in modern Washington ever expected to hear again. Maybe the future was wrong. He picked up the secure phone and dialed a number only 6 people on Earth were cleared to answer. When the voice on the other end acknowledged, McNamara did not waste words. "Admiral, I need the New Jersey. I need her yesterday." There was a long silence, then a single word in reply, "Understood." The Secretary of Defense hung up, rested both palms on the cold tabletop, and felt something he had not felt since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Pure animal fear. Meanwhile, in the mothball fleet anchorage at Bremerton, Washington, the USS New Jersey lay cocooned in fog and silence. Her teak decks had gone silver with age, her great turrets were sealed under steel plates and cosmoline, and seagulls nested undisturbed in the barrels that had once hurled 2,700-pound shells across half the Pacific in a different war. She looked dead. She had been dead, officially, for 11 years. Sailors walking past on newer ships joked that she was the world's largest artificial reef waiting to happen. No one had fired her guns since 1953. No one had even turned her turbines since Eisenhower was president. Yet beneath the rust and bird droppings, the old girl was merely sleeping. Her armor belt was still 2 feet of hardened steel. Her boilers, though cold, were the same triple expansion giants that had driven her through typhoons at 33 knots. And inside her fire rooms, the gauges still worked. In her magazines, thousands of tons of powder and projectile waited exactly where they had been left, preserved like insects in amber. She was a time capsule containing the concentrated violence of 1944, And now the United States of America was about to rip the lid off that capsule and drop it into the middle of 1968. The order went out at dawn on September 25, 1967. Dockyard workers who had spent their careers cutting torches through old warships suddenly found themselves welding, painting, and coaxing life back into one. Retired chiefs who had served on Iowa-class battleships during Korea were dragged out of fishing boats and golf courses and handed new orders that read "Report immediately to USS New Jersey." College boys who had never seen anything larger than a destroyer were told they would learn to load 16-inch shells that weighed more than their family cars. The Navy sent frantic teletypes to ammunition depots in Oklahoma and Nevada. Begin immediate shipment of Mark 7 armor-piercing rounds and HC high-capacity shells last manufactured in 1954. The nation that had declared the battleship extinct was suddenly behaving as if the Dinosaur had only been playing dead. Back in Vietnam, Lieutenant Riley's platoon was still alive when the sun came up on September 13th, though no one could explain how. The NVA had pulled back at first light, leaving behind hundreds of their own dead and a perimeter littered with American bodies. Riley sat on an ammunition crate, staring at the radio that had betrayed him. A Navy lieutenant from the Supporting Arms Coordination Center crawled over, face black with soot, and handed him a mug of coffee that tasted like battery acid. "You're not going to believe this," the Navy man said, voice shaking with something between laughter and hysteria. "They're sending us a battleship. A real one. 16-inch guns. The New Jersey. She's on her way." Riley stared at him for 5 full seconds, then started laughing so hard he vomited into the mud. When he could speak again, he wiped his mouth and asked the only question that mattered. "How long?" The Navy lieutenant looked toward the empty sea beyond the wire and answered quietly, "Long enough for some of us to live." In shipyards across the country, floodlights burned through the nights. Welders worked in shifts measured in minutes rather than hours. Cranes lifted away the steel tombs that had covered the great turrets for a decade, revealing the rifled barrels beneath, still gleaming faintly under their grease. Sailors who had trained on missile trackers now learned to hand-ram powder bags the size of coffins. The smell of fresh paint fought with the smell of cosmoline and history. And every man who climbed the newly painted gangway felt the same chill of walking into a legend that was suddenly, impossibly breathing again. The resurrection had begun. The last battleship on Earth was stretching muscles no one remembered she still possessed. And somewhere out in the South China Sea, a stretch of water that had never seen a dreadnought in anger, the jungle waited. But when the Dinosaur opened its eyes, the war itself shifted. The Long Beach Naval Shipyard had never slept in the winter of 1967-68, but it had never burned this bright either. Floodlights turned the night into surgical white, and the air rang with the scream of cutting torches, the thunder of pneumatic hammers, and the constant, metallic heartbeat of cranes swinging half-ton plates through the fog. At the USS New Jersey lay in dry dock number 1 like a steel continent that had been dragged in from the deep. Her hull plates, once hidden under red lead and barnacles, now gleamed raw and silver, where workers had blasted centuries of salt away. From the waterline to the top of her tower mast, she was surrounded by scaffolding that looked like the ribs of some larger, parasitic creature feeding on her resurrection. Inside the Pentagon, Robert McNamara faced a storm of disbelief that made the monsoon over Con Thien look gentle. The Joint Chiefs sat around the polished table in a silence so complete the ticking of the wall clock sounded like incoming artillery. Admiral Thomas Moore, Chief of Naval Operations, finally broke it. "Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, this is insane. We are asking a World War II museum piece to fight a war of helicopters and heat-seeking missiles. The press will crucify us. Congress will laugh us out of the door." McNamara did not raise his voice. He simply slid a single photograph across the table. The smoking remains of an A-6 intruder lying across the deck of the carrier Constellation, its 2-man crew already listed as missing. "They are already crucifying our boys," he said. "And no one is laughing at Kassan right now." The room went quiet again. The photograph stayed where it was. The skeptics were everywhere. Time magazine ran a mocking editorial titled, "McNamara's Dinosaur." The New York Times quoted anonymous admirals who called the recommissioning a desperate political stunt dressed up as strategy. Even inside the Navy, destroyer captains sneered that the New Jersey would be nothing more than the world's largest target drone once North Vietnamese shore batteries got her range. McNamara ignored them all. He had run the numbers. Fast air support was being shredded by radar-guided 57mm and 100mm guns. Tactical air sorties were down 40% along the DMZ. Ground commanders were screaming for fire support that could reach 25 miles inland without having to fly through a curtain of steel. The Secretary of Defense had reached the same cold conclusion that desperate men have reached since the invention of gunpowder. When everything modern fails, try something so old, the enemy has forgotten how to defend against it. In Long Beach, the ship herself seemed to resist waking up. Boilers that had been stone cold for 11 years cracked and groaned as steam was slowly introduced. Salt crystals the size of fists exploded out of the pipes with sharp reports that sent inexperienced enginemen diving for cover. 40,000-ton hull plates flexed and popped like rifle shots as the dry dock was flooded and the ship took her weight on the water for the first time since 1957. One night, a massive 16-inch gun barrel in Turret 2, frozen solid with cosmoline and rust, refused to elevate. A grizzled chief gunner's mate named Kowalski, who had served on her in Korea, climbed into the pit with a cutting torch and a bottle of Jack Daniels. He poured whiskey down the breech like a libation to an angry god, then spent 6 hours burning the corrosion away. When the barrel finally moved again, the entire shipyard crew, hundreds of men, stood on the pier and cheered as if a child had taken its first step. The crew assembling around her was a study in contrasts. 1/3 were gray-haired recalls. Men in their 40s and 50s who had thought their sea days were over forever. Another third were teenagers straight out of Great Lakes boot camp who had never seen a ship with portholes instead of air conditioning ducts. The final third were officers who had spent their careers on missile cruisers and now found themselves learning how to plot a fire mission with a mechanical computer the size of a pickup truck. They drilled in the rain, in the dark, in the freezing January wind off the Pacific. They learned to wrestle 2,700-pound projectiles with chain hoists and muscle. They learned that powder bags came in silk and burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and that if you dropped one, you were dead before you hit the deck. They learned that the ship's analog fire control computer, nicknamed Old Brains, could still outshoot any digital system in the fleet when the sky was full of chaff and jamming. On April 6, 1968, the USS New Jersey steamed out of Long Beach Harbor under her own power for the first time in 15 years. The ceremony was deliberately small. No bands, no politicians, no speeches. Just a few hundred wives and children on the pier waving flags in the cold morning light. As the great bow slid past the breakwater, a lone civilian tug sounded 3 long blasts on its whistle, an old mariner's salute to a lady going to war. The battleship answered with one deep, bone-rattling bellow from her own siren that rolled across the water and made seagulls explode into the sky. Somewhere inside Turret 3, a 20-year-old loader from Ohio named Ramirez crossed himself and whispered, "We're really doing this." The voyage west took 21 days. She steamed alone, no carrier escort, no destroyer screen. Just one gray Leviathan cutting a white wake across an empty ocean. Her crew worked around the clock, calibrating the guns, running emergency breakouts, learning the 1,000 forgotten rituals of big gun warfare. On the 5th day out, they conducted the first live fire exercise since reactivation. Turret 2 trained out to starboard, elevated to 45 degrees, and fired a single reduced charge round into the empty Pacific. The entire ship leapt sideways in the water as if kicked by God. A column of white water rose half a mile high 23 miles away. On the bridge, Captain Edward Snyder, a man who had spent his career on aircraft carriers, felt the deck shudder beneath his feet and muttered, "Mother of Christ, they weren't exaggerating." From that moment on, no one joked about the old girl anymore. Half a world away, North Vietnamese radio monitors picked up the first fragmented reports of a massive American warship heading west. Intelligence officers in Hanoi pored over Jane's fighting ships and came back pale. One colonel reportedly told his staff, "The imperialists have gone mad. They are sending the battleship New Jersey. I sank a destroyer off Haiphong in 1950. I know what those guns can do." The news filtered down to division and regimental level. Some officers laughed it off as capitalist propaganda. Others quietly moved their headquarters deeper into caves. On the evening of April 28, 1968, the USS New Jersey dropped anchor off the mouth of the Quaviet River, 60 miles southeast of the DMZ. The sun was setting blood red behind the Annamite Mountains, and the jungle breathed out its daily ration of heat and rot. Forward observers on the hills that had never seen the ocean in their lives looked through binoculars and saw her for the first time. A cliff of steel squatting on the horizon, guns elevated like accusing fingers. One Marine sergeant turned to his radio man and said simply, "Tell the gooks the world just ended." That night, the ship's crew stood topside in silence, staring at the blacked-out coast. Somewhere in that green darkness, their shells would land in less than 48 hours. Men who had trained for months suddenly felt the full, insane weight of what they were about to do. A gunner's mate lit a cigarette with shaking hands and spoke for all of them. "We're taking a 1943 battleship into a 1968 war. Either we're geniuses or we're the biggest damned fools who ever wore bell-bottoms." Far below, in the armored citadel of the fire control tower, old brains clicked and whirred as it ingested the first targeting data of the new war. The last battleship on Earth was alive again and heading toward the jungle. The first time the USS New Jersey spoke in anger in the Vietnam War, the world did not hear it the way it had in 1944. There were no cheering destroyers alongside, no spotter planes circling overhead, no proud newsreels waiting to capture the broadside. There was only a blacked-out coast, a silent sea, and a single order crackling over a secure voice circuit at 4:17 on the morning of September 30th, 1968. Battery released, fire mission troop. Target grid XS 24567. Enemy regiment in the open. Danger close, shoot. In the armored bowels of the ship, red lights came on. Klaxons gave their ancient, mournful howl. Men who had been asleep on powder cans jerked awake as if electrocuted. Turrets 1, 2, and 3 rotated with the slow majesty of cathedral doors opening. The great 67-foot barrels rose in perfect unison until they pointed inland at 42 degrees, higher than any aircraft would ever fly on a bombing run. In the plotting room, old brains, the mechanical Mark 8 fire control computer, clattered and spun, ingesting wind, temperature, humidity, powder age, even the curvature of the Earth. The solution took 7 seconds. The human brain could not have done it in 7 minutes. Then the guns fired. There was no warning, no countdown, no dramatic pause, just an instantaneous white flash that lit the sea for miles, a concussion that slapped the water flat, and a roar that rolled across the waves like the end of the world. 9 2,700-pound shells left the muzzles at 2,700 feet per second, faster than the speed of sound. The overpressure punched men on the forecastle to their knees, even though they were wearing double ear protection. Overhead, the shells climbed invisibly into the night sky, arcing higher than jetliners cruise, before beginning their long, supersonic fall toward a ridgeline 24 miles away. 24 miles inland, a young Marine forward observer named Corporal Eddie Morales lay prone in elephant grass on Hill 861, clutching a radio handset slick with sweat and someone else's blood. His platoon had been watching an entire NVA battalion march south in column along a valley floor, arrogantly certain no fire support could reach them. Morales had called the mission Danger Close because the enemy was only 800 meters from friendly lines. He had never expected anyone to accept it. Then he heard it first. A sound like an express train tearing the sky in half. A shriek so high and sharp it felt as if the atmosphere itself was screaming in pain. Every man on the hill, American and North Vietnamese alike, looked up instinctively. Then the night turned white. 9 shells arrived almost simultaneously, detonating in a perfect ladder across the valley floor. The flash was so bright it cast razor shadows on the clouds above. The concussion arrived a full second later. A physical wall of air that flattened trees, hurled men 30 feet, and ruptured eardrums for a mile in every direction. When the smoke cleared, the valley was simply gone. Where there had been a battalion, there was now a smoking gouge in the earth the size of 3 football fields. Body parts hung from shattered trees like obscene fruit. The few survivors crawled blindly, mouths open in silent screams because the blast had stolen their hearing. Morales keyed his handset with a hand that would not stop shaking. Shot. Over. Splash. Over. A long pause. End of mission. Target destroyed. Sir, the entire fucking valley is gone. Repeat, the valley is no longer there. On the New Jersey's bridge, Captain Snyder lowered his binoculars and spoke the first words anyone had heard him say in 10 minutes. Gentlemen, I believe we are in business. That single shoot was only the overture. For the next 6 months, the battleship prowled the coast of IN-2 Corps like a shark that had learned to walk on land. She never came closer than 10 miles to shore. There was no need. Her guns could reach 25 miles inland with standard ammunition, and 38 miles with the rare extended-range shells dug out of storage bunkers in Oklahoma. Forward observers began calling her the Thunder God. Radiomen simply called her Big J, and they said the name the way Catholics say Mary. The process became ritual. A Marine or Army unit pinned down by superior numbers would call the direct support frequency. A calm voice, always calm, no matter how much incoming fire crackled in the background, would answer, "This is New Jersey, standing by with 9 guns. Send your traffic." The observer would read off a 10-digit grid, add the words "troops in the open" or "bunkers" or "artillery position," and then almost shyly, "danger close if you can." The voice would reply, "Roger, danger close. Stand by for shot in 30 seconds." 28 seconds later, the sky would scream. 35 seconds later, the problem would cease to exist. The sensory reality of a 16-inch barrage defied description, but men tried anyway. They said it sounded like God tearing steel sheets the size of highways. They said the ground buckled like a living thing trying to escape. They said the flash lit the jungle so brightly that for one frozen instant you could read a letter from home without a flashlight. They said the overpressure sucked the air from your lungs and left you gasping like fish. And they said that after the last shell landed, there was always a moment of perfect, stunned silence, as if the jungle itself had forgotten how to breathe. Inside the ship, the work was brutal, beautiful, and strangely intimate. In the magazines, powder men and projectile men worked in temperatures that topped 130 degrees, passing silk bags and shells in a choreographed dance older than any man aboard. In the turrets, breach operators swung open doors that weighed more than tanks, rammed home the charges, and slammed them shut with hydraulic grace. In the plotting room, chief fire controlmen in sweat-soaked khakis watched brass gears the size of dinner plates spin out solutions with an accuracy no modern computer could match when the air was full of chaff and lies. Every man knew his life depended on the man below him and above him. They worked 16 on, 8 off for weeks at a time, living on coffee, cigarettes, and the knowledge that somewhere inland, a kid they would never meet was staying alive because they did not miss. The enemy learned quickly. NVA units began refusing to mass in the open when the New Jersey was on station. Regimental commanders ordered their men to dig deeper, disperse wider, move only at night. Captured documents later revealed that soldiers were being told ghost stories about a black ship of death that could strike from beyond the horizon without warning. One prisoner, when shown a photograph of the battleship, began weeping uncontrollably and begged not to be sent back north. By December 1968, the pattern was set. Before any major Marine or Army operation along the coast, the first question asked in the briefing tent was never, "Where is the air support?" It was, "Where is Big J?" She became the fixed star by which everything else oriented. Helicopters flew in her shadow. Artillery batteries registered their guns off her fall of shot. Infantry companies advanced with the calm certainty that if they got in trouble, the sky would simply open and the hand of an angry god would reach down and erase whatever was trying to kill them. On the night of December 23rd, a Marine recon team Viper Tango found itself surrounded on 3 sides near the rock pile. The team leader called for extraction and was told no helicopters could get through the triple canopy and the 37mm fire. He then called the New Jersey. 41 seconds later, the ridgeline behind the team ceased to exist in a chain of fireballs that rolled uphill like the wrath of Moses. When the dust settled, the team walked out unmolested. Their after-action report contained only one line about the fire support. Before soldiers saw salvation, they heard the scream of the dinosaur's breath. By January 1969, the USS New Jersey had become something the 20th century was no longer supposed to allow. A living myth. She was no longer merely a ship, she was a presence, an atmosphere, a verdict written in high explosive. North Vietnamese soldiers began calling her Con Thien, the Black Ghost Ship. Captured diaries spoke of her in the same breath as typhoons and earthquakes, forces of nature that could not be fought, only endured. One regimental political officer tried to rally his men by declaring the battleship a paper tiger of the imperialists. The next morning, his regiment was erased from the map by a 9-gun salvo that landed while the men were still eating breakfast. After that, no one argued with the ghost ship anymore. The psychological effect was total. Units that had spent years perfecting infiltration tactics now froze at the sound of distant turbines on the coast. Commanders who once planned elaborate ambushes now dispersed their forces into platoon-sized packets because anything larger drew the immediate attention of the sky-screaming shells. Entire battalions surrendered after single barrages, walking out of the jungle with hands raised, shouting in broken English, "No more big gun! No more big gun!" One Marine company accepted the surrender of 127 NVA soldiers who had thrown their weapons into a river and marched toward American lines carrying a white bedsheet on a bamboo pole. When asked why they gave up so easily, their lieutenant answered through an interpreter. "Because death now comes from a place we cannot see, cannot shoot back at, cannot hide from. We fought helicopters, we fought jets, we never fought napalm, but we never fought a god." On the American side, the battleship's reputation grew into something close to worship. Infantrymen painted her silhouette on helmets and flak jackets. Forward observers tattooed 16-inch across their forearms like rosary beads. Mail call brought boxes of cookies and handwritten letters addressed simply to the crew of the Thunder God South China Sea. One package contained a single Polaroid, a Marine lieutenant holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Thank you for letting us live long enough to hate this place." The photo was passed from hand to hand in the mess decks until it was creased and soft as cloth. The most famous single mission of the deployment happened on the night of February 24, 1969, during Operation Dewey Canyon in the Ashau Valley. The 9th Marines were pushing west along Route 922 when they stumbled into a major NVA supply complex hidden under triple canopy jungle. Intelligence estimated 3,000 enemy troops, dozens of 122mm guns, and a stockpile large enough to supply the entire Ho Chi Minh Trail for a month. Airstrikes were impossible, the ceiling was 200 feet, and the valley walls were ringed with ZPU-4 quad machine guns. The Marines dug in on a ridge and prepared for a last stand. At 21:17, the battalion fire support coordinator called the New Jersey with a request that sounded suicidal. "Need a 270-degree ring of steel around our position, danger close, maximum ordnance, continuous fire for as long as you've got ammunition." On the battleship, Captain Snyder looked at his gunnery officer and asked the only question that mattered. "How much do we have left?" "Enough to empty half the magazine, sir. About 600 rounds." Snyder nodded once. "Then give it to them." What followed lasted 73 minutes and rewrote every textbook on naval gunfire support. The New Jersey turned her broadside to the coast and began firing in a slow, deliberate rhythm. One turret every 8 seconds, rotating through the full circle of the compass. Shells fell in a perfect ring of fire around the Marine perimeter, walking outward in 100-meter increments, like the hand of a clock sweeping the jungle clean. From the ridge, the Marines watched the night turn into a flickering orange hell. Trees vaporized, bunkers collapsed, secondary explosions from ammunition caches lit the clouds from beneath like lightning inside a thunderhead. The sound never stopped, just rose and fell in waves, a continuous rolling earthquake that made the fillings in men's teeth ache. When it finally ended, the jungle for 5 miles in every direction had been flattened into a moonscape of smoking craters. At first light, a helicopter flew over the valley to assess damage. The pilot's transmission was brief and stunned. There's nothing left. Nothing taller than my knee. I can see the riverbed 3 miles away. It's like the moon landed. The Marines advanced unopposed and counted 1,847 enemy dead, so many that burial details worked for 3 days. They also found something no one expected, an intact regimental command bunker, whose concrete walls had been peeled open like a tin can. Inside, pinned under a fallen beam, was the body of a North Vietnamese colonel still clutching a map. On the map, someone had scrawled in Vietnamese, "If the black ship comes, we die. There is no defense." That map was flown back to the New Jersey and pinned to the bulkhead outside the captain's cabin. No one ever took it down. The terror worked both ways. On the ship, men began to feel the weight of what they had become. Gunners' mates, who once joked about sending Volkswagen-sized presents, now spoke in hushed tones about the screams they sometimes heard on the wind after a mission. A Catholic chaplain held mass in the shadow of Turret 2 and told the crew, "We are not just warriors. We are the wrath of God made steel. Remember mercy when you can." Few slept well anymore. They had seen too many photographs of what their shells did to human bodies, yet the requests never stopped coming. Khe Sanh, the Rock Pile, Mutter's Ridge, Gonoi Island. Every name became another chapter in the growing legend. By March, the New Jersey had fired 5,688 16-inch rounds, more than she had expended in all of World War II, and an additional 14,000 5-inch shells. Her barrels were worn smooth. Replacement liners were flown out by emergency airlift. Her crew had not seen a port in 4 months. They were exhausted, sunburned, half-deaf, and fiercely proud. And still the war asked for more. In Hanoi, the Politburo held emergency sessions. Intelligence officers presented evidence that troop morale along the coast was collapsing. Desertion rates had tripled. Recruitment in coastal provinces had fallen to almost zero. No one wanted to fight the province that contained the Black Ghost ship. One general reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "They have brought back the devil from the imperialist war. How do we kill a devil?" They never found an answer. On the night of March 31, 1969, an Army advisor with the 1st ARVN Division called in a fire mission on an NVA Division headquarters hidden inside a limestone karst. The New Jersey answered with a single turret, 3 guns, high-capacity shells with delayed fuses. The shells bored straight through 100 feet of solid rock before detonating. The entire mountaintop lifted 50 feet into the air and collapsed into itself. When ARVN troops reached the site 2 days later, they found a crater 300 meters wide and no survivors. The advisor's after-action report ended with a line that was quoted in every briefing from Saigon to Washington. To Americans, she was hope. To the North, she was an ancient god of fire. April 1969. The monsoon had broken early, and the sea off Vietnam ran the color of wet cement. The USS New Jersey steamed slow circles 10 miles off Da Nang, her paint blistered by salt white, her barrels scorched black at the muzzles. She had been on the gun line without rotation for 183 days. Her crew had fired more tonnage of shells in 6 months than most fleets expend in a decade. They were the most feared warship on Earth, and they were bone-tired. In Washington, everything had already changed. Richard Nixon had taken the oath in January promising peace with honor. The new Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, believed honor could be negotiated cheaper than 16-inch ammunition. Vietnamization was the word of the hour. Turn the war over to the South Vietnamese, bring the boys home, cut the budget. Battleships were spectacularly bad at Vietnamization. They required 2,500 American sailors, millions of dollars a month, and powder manufactured in 1953. They could not be handed to ARVN officers. They could not fit inside the new cost-benefit spreadsheets. On April 3, 1969, a coded message arrived in Captain Snyder's safe. Prepare to detach from Gunline 10 April. Proceed Subic Bay for ammunition offload and crew reduction. Future employment under review. Snyder read it twice, folded it once, and locked it back in the safe without telling a soul. That night, he walked the weather decks alone. The ship smelled of burnt cordite, hot oil, and something older. The smell of 1943 clinging to steel that refused to admit it was obsolete. He laid a hand on the warm barrel of turret 2 and spoke aloud to no one. "We're not done yet, old girl. Not while there are still boys dying in that green hell." But the orders stood. The final 10 days were a farewell tour, written in fire. On April 5th, the 1st Marines assaulted Gonoy Island. The New Jersey fired 568 rounds in 8 hours, flattening every bunker complex on the island, and allowing the Leathernecks to walk ashore against only scattered rifle fire. On April 7th, she supported the 101st Airborne near the Aishau, erasing an NVA regiment that had massed for a counterattack. On the night of April 9th, she answered one last desperate call from a Special Forces camp at Langvay, surrounded and running out of ammunition. She fired until her magazines were empty, until the barrels glowed dull red and the breech temperatures hit 800 degrees. When dawn came, the camp was still American, and the jungle for 3 miles around looked like the surface of the moon after a meteor storm. Then, it was over. At 08 on April 10, 1969, the USS New Jersey turned her bow southeast and steamed away from the coast of Vietnam for the last time. No bands played. No helicopters flew overhead in salute. Just a gray ship disappearing into gray rain, while the men on her decks stood at parade rest and stared at a shoreline that had learned to fear them. The voyage home was quiet. They buried 3 men at sea. Heart attacks, a fall down a ladder, a suicide no one talked about. They scraped carbon from rifle bores the diameter of sewer pipes. They painted over the scorch marks and the names of girls back home that had been chalked on shell casings. In Subic Bay, they offloaded the remaining ammunition into barges, tons of powder and projectile that would never be used again. Then the reduction began. 1,200 men detached for reassignment, leaving a skeleton crew to bring the Dinosaur home to sleep. She reached Long Beach on May 17, 1969. A small crowd waited on the pier. Wives, children, a few reporters, and one Marine colonel in dress blues holding a hand-lettered sign that read simply, "Thank you from the 3rd Marine Division." The ship tied up without fanfare. The brow hit the pier at 10:42 a.m. At 10:43, the first man walked down. It was Chief Kowalski, the Korean war gunner who had poured whiskey down Turret 2's throat 15 months earlier. He paused halfway, turned, and saluted the quarterdeck with tears cutting clean tracks through the salt on his cheeks. Decommissioning took 4 months. They drained the boilers, cocooned the guns, pumped the magazines full of inert gas. On December 17, 1969, the colors were hauled down for what everyone assumed was the final time. The New Jersey was towed back to Bremerton and nested among the other ghosts. Her official log closed with a single line: expended in combat, 5,866 16-inch rounds, 14,890 5-inch rounds. Enemy casualties inflicted, estimated 18,000 plus. American lives saved, uncountable. The legend, however, refused to die. Veterans told the stories in VFW halls and high school history classes. They spoke of nights when the sky screamed and the earth opened. They spoke of a ship that arrived when hope was gone and left only silence behind. In 1982, when Ronald Reagan ordered her reactivated for Lebanon and Central America, the old hand smiled quietly and said, "Told you she wasn't finished." She served again in the Gulf War, hurling Tomahawk missiles this time. But everyone knew her heart still belonged to the 16-inch rifles and the jungle coast of 1968 to 69. Today she lies at Camden, New Jersey, a museum ship polished and proud. Children run across her teak decks and climb inside turrets that once erased mountains. Old men in wheelchairs roll to the rail, place a trembling hand on warm steel, and whisper the same thing every time. She was the answer when there were no answers left. The official histories call her Vietnam tour a footnote, an anachronism, a desperate stopgap. The men who were there call it something else. They say that for one brief, furious moment in a war that broke every rule, the past reached forward and saved the present. They say that when jets fell burning and helicopters bled out and the jungles swallowed entire companies, America reached into its attic, dusted off a monster from another age, and set it loose with 9 roaring mouths. She entered Vietnam as a relic and left as the last legend of naval thunder. She proved that sometimes the future needs the past to survive. She proved that raw, overwhelming, unstoppable power still speaks a language every tyrant understands. And she proved that when modern war failed, when missiles missed and politics paralyzed and the sky itself turned hostile, ancient firepower, simple, brutal, honest, saved lives. The Dinosaur was never outdated. The battlefield was. She sleeps now, but the jungle still remembers the sound of her voice. If you love untold military history, stories of steel and thunder, and the men who refused to let hope die, subscribe. There are more legends waiting in the dark. She was not a relic. She was the answer.